Hi, this is Vantage Point and I'm Cynthia Ng, and the topic for today we'll be discussing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now my guest today, he's an Israeli human rights activist. He's also an author of this book that I have here in my hand, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Miko Peled to Malaysia, and secondly, thank you so much for making time for this program. You came from quite an elite military family in Israel. In fact, your grandfather was a Zionist leader. Your father was a general in the Six-Day War in 1967. You yourself served in the army as well. But that took a turn in your life, and you took a different road, and you wrote about it, challenging the official narrative that has been told over and over again in Israel and also outside Israel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you just give us an idea what narrative that you're opposing?
The narrative that I'm opposing is one that claims, first of all, that Jewish people have a right to live in Palestine, that all Jewish people have a right to live in Palestine because they are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, which I think is, well, I think there's no foundation to it. It's baseless, and also the narrative that says that the Jews that did come to Palestine, the Zionists, came with the intention of creating some kind of a democracy, some kind of a haven for Jews, and so on and so forth, and they were attacked by the Arabs constantly, which is why they had to become a military power and so forth. This is a narrative that's out there that portrays the Israeli side, the Zionist side, as victims, that portrays them as being of possessing the moral high ground. In other words, that their cause is the morally justified. And it's also a narrative that allows Israel to continue in its criminal and defenseless policies against the Palestinians. So there's a connection, I think, between understanding and opposing the narrative and understanding and opposing the conflict. And quite often you hear people say, well, we need to put history aside and deal with the issues today. You can't do this in this context. You have to bring the history in because it is part of the conflict.
I'd like to go back a bit on your personal history. Your dad was a general, and he later on became a proponent of Palestinian human rights. But back then, he still believed in the Jewish state.
Yes.
And yourself, I think you have taken a different stance. That is, you believe in order for a lasting peace to Palestine, there is a need for a binational state, a one-state solution.
After 1967, Israel became a binational state. The conquest of the West Bank and Gaza made it a binational state. Now, my father's stance and stance of other Israelis like him was that if the Palestinians are not allowed to create their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, this binational state will become the reality. There will be no more Jewish state. So he came to this from the perspective, not only is it the moral thing to do for the Palestinians, but we will destroy ourselves as Israelis. And he also believed that the Palestinians who live within Israel deserve equal rights. But in terms of what Israel did, in terms of the Israeli perspective as a whole, once they took the West Bank and Gaza, they had absolutely no intention of ever reversing that, or allowing anybody to reverse it. So they began building cities and towns and so forth in the West Bank, just like they did in other parts of Palestine, with exclusive rights for Jews. And so I think Israel kind of sealed its own fate by creating the binational state. So today it is one state. It's a binational, non-democratic, or more like an apartheid state, where you have laws for Israeli Jews that are democratic, laws for Palestinians with citizenship that many of them are racist laws that discriminate against them specifically, and then the laws, which are really no laws, that protect the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they're at the mercy of the Israeli military, and it hasn't shown any mercy. So this is the reality, but everybody's governed as one state, only under different laws. So the question now is, well, where do we go from here? I don't see that there can be a peace as long as Israel remains this Zionist entity. The only way that there can be peace is beyond Zionism, is beyond the Zionist paradigm, which means it will be a democracy, which means this binational state will be a democratic binational state.
How aware are Israelis themselves towards the situation in Palestine and about the treatment of the army towards Palestinians?
Yes, well, what's interesting is this. The Israeli perspective is one that says perhaps we do some things that are harsh, but we have no choice. We're surrounded by enemies. We're surrounded by Arabs who hate us. They hate us because we're here. They hate us because we're Jewish. But because we're Jewish, we have to be here. So it's a catch-22. There's no solution. And that is how they justify what they're doing. So they can, kill civilians in Gaza. They can drop hundreds of tons of bombs on Gaza. They can shell refugee camps in southern Lebanon, which they've been doing for decades, and still justified by saying, well, maybe it's harsh, but we have no choice. We have to defend ourselves. The thing is that this argument doesn't hold any water. It's just absolutely not true. None of it is true. Israel has absolutely proven that it is not interested in peace. All the advances by Palestinians and other Arab countries to try to make peace with Israel and solve the Palestinian issue, Israel turned away, manipulated itself out of in many ways. This ongoing so-called peace process is something that is only helping Israel continue its policies against the Palestinians, of discrimination and so forth. And so Israelis see it from a very narrow perspective. They feel they must do what they do to survive. I think my advantage was that because of my own experience and because of my father's experience, of course, I was able to step beyond that. And once you step beyond that perspective, particularly out of that Zionist stronghold, you see there are other possibilities. And I think the best possibility for Israelis and for Palestinians is that of a democracy, is that of a free society, a pluralistic society, which allows everybody to live and flourish as equals.
Back to your the one-state solution that you mentioned in your book and also in your talks. It is somewhat still a boogeyman, I would say, in mainstream Israeli politics, not a viable option. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu has said that accepting a one-state solution is akin to not recognizing the rights of Israel. So how do you go about that, having that internal resistance, firstly, to create more support to the Palestinian plight? Because you mentioned that Israelis themselves, they are still not that exposed to the alternative narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, I don't think it's my responsibility or anybody's responsibility to convince Netanyahu. None of us will.
Yes.
I don't think if we had to wait for all whites in South Africa to be convinced that apartheid is wrong, there would still be apartheid. And so I don't think it matters what they think or how they see it. I think the reality is going to be such that they wake up in the morning one day and it's changed. And he's right, supporting a democratic state in Palestine as opposed to what exists today, which is a non-democratic one state in Palestine, is not recognizing the rights of Israel. And I think that's the right thing to do. I don't think Israel has a right to exist in this context the way it is today. I think the right thing to do would be to have Israel transform Israel, the Zionist entity that exists there today, into a democracy, the way South Africa was transformed when apartheid fell apart and it became a democracy. I think the challenges that South Africa face are not the same challenges that Palestine will face. I think Palestine has much better possibilities and promises more of an optimist. I think there's room for more optimism in Palestine than it was in South Africa. Even, but definitely he's right. This means we oppose his right.
That is a deal breaker. If
it is a deal breaker, but that's fine. They don't have to agree, and I don't think they will agree. I don't think privileged people ever agree to give up their privilege.
Of course. If you're looking at the South African model to when it ended the apartheid, there were three factors that came into play. Firstly is internal resistance, external pressure, and also economic pressure. We mentioned a bit about internal resistance, which is still relatively low within Israel itself, but we have people like you who's going all around the world to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we talk about external pressure, we talk about economic pressure, BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It is well known that there is a strong Israeli lobby in the financial sector, in the corporate sector, and also in one of the most powerful country in the world, the United States. So they are saying that if nothing changes in the United States, there won't be much changes in Israel itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there definitely has to be a change. I think there has to be a change in the West, and there is a change that's taking place. It's not as fast as we'd like it to be. And I think the resistance within Palestine is significant. It seems, I think it seems small, but I think it's significant in the big picture, because people are realizing that the Palestinians, first of all, they have a moral cause and a cause that's just, and their resistance is principled. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance is not armed resistance. It's different resistance, and it's principled, and it's clear, and it's persistent. This is a resistance that Israel will never be able to defeat. They already have thousands of Palestinians in prisons. They're already killing and countless Palestinian leaders, clergymen, intellectuals, and it's not ending. The resistance is only getting stronger, and it's getting a broader support from around the world. Now, it's true that Israel has a strong lobby in the United States, but it's only strong because it's effective and it's been around for a very long time. So they have influenced, like you said, the media. They've influenced education systems. They've influenced politics. Of course, you can't get elected in America unless you support Israel. But all that is subject to change. I mean, none of that is a God-given right or anything like that. All of this can change, and it is changing because more and more people are realizing that this clear pro-Israeli approach that America has taken is wrong. That giving $3, $4, $5 billion a year to a country that doesn't need it. Israel is not a developing country. It doesn't need foreign aid. Is unjustifiable. If you're going to give the money, give it to a country that needs it. And then there's a moral issue too. Churches in America, big churches, are taking a closer look at this. They're supporting maybe not all of the BDS, but certain aspect, boycotting certain goods, for example, and so on.
So personally, do you see there's a broader sense of wanting to understand the narrative
Yes.
from the Palestinian side?
Yes, and understanding also that there is another side, that the story isn't so clear. I speak, when I speak in America, sometimes I speak in front of audiences that are more conservative, less open to this idea, and at the end people come up to me and say, this is an interesting idea, we never heard of this before. So people want to hear about this because they see that this is a realistic solution. It's a solution that we can actually accomplish, that we can actually see in our lifetime.
Well, within Israel, the education system in Israel somewhat is indoctrinated to prepare the young people to serve in military, to protect ourselves against the enemy, which is portrayed as the Arabs and the Palestinians as well. So how do you reckon you can go about to changing that whereby it's so entrenched in the system itself in Israel?
Yes, well, the education system is a problem. I mean, the Zionists developed an education system that the book, Palestine and Israeli School Books, that was authored by my sister, proves, and probably the most damning aspect of the book is that it proves that the racism in Israeli education system is not anecdotal, it's systemic. And it's built on models of teaching racism. And I'm a product of that education system, which is interesting. But I don't think that's going to change until everything else changes. That is going to be part of the change once there is a democracy and Israelis realize that the education system needs to change, that the other narrative has to be included, that Palestinian might be a prime minister one day and Israelis are going to have to live with that, and it's not the end of the world. This is all part of that process that will come, I think, the day after.
So you would say that it will take external pressure to give way to a bigger internal resistance?
Yes, I think the two certainly go hand in hand, absolutely.
Okay, well, in essence, Israel is, like you say, is inevitably will not be able to suppress the will of the Palestinian. And by 2016, it's projected that the Palestinian population in Israel, West Bank, and even Gaza will outnumber the non-Arab citizens. Do you feel that we are already at a stage where suppression of Palestinian will boil over? And if it does, how are you confident that it will boil over in a non-violent way? Because that is the contention of Israelis in regards to having a one-state solution, or any other solution, in fact.
Yes, Palestinians are going to be a majority. That's the way it's going to be. I don't know that there's a threat there. I don't know why that's a problem. I mean, I don't know that Israeli Jews have some kind of unique presence.
Because they have privileges, firstly.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond losing privileges, but they can share those privileges, and still everybody will have plenty of privileges. So I don't think that's the problem. But they portray it, like you said, as a threat, as though Palestinian having many Arab children is somehow a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's the reality, which is why you need to have a real democracy, which is why you need to make sure that the rights of all minorities are protected. And I think this fear-mongering and saying that the Palestinians are going to kill us and if they become a majority they will slit our throats is foundless and baseless. There's no reason to think that way. Certainly history hasn't shown it to be that way. And I think it's in a way it's natural for people to fear change. At the same time, we can't let that be, determine what change is going to be. The change has to happen, and there's no guarantees that there won't be violence. Nobody can guarantee that, other than those of us who are taking part in the struggle. We have to make sure it's up to us whether it becomes violent or not. Violence is not something that happens on its own. Violence is somebody picking up a gun and killing another person, and that's a choice. So we need to make sure that, and as much as we can, that it doesn't become violent.
Okay, but we are still quite far away from discussing for that one-state solution possibility. But we're looking at the demographics, they're expanding, a number of Palestinians, and we're looking at the conditions that they're living in right now. Do you feel that the window for a one-state solution is narrowing?
No, I think it's inevitable. No, I mean, it's one of those things, when I talk to people who are active with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, they all say the same thing. A year before South Africa fell, apartheid fell, if somebody would suggest that it would take one more year, they think he was crazy because nobody thought apartheid would fall as soon as it did. So you never know when it's going to happen. I think the inevitability of the process isn't bound or by anything. I mean, I think the fact that there are more Palestinians, Palestinians are a very educated society. They're a very productive society. I think they would be wonderful neighbors to anybody, and I think Israelis are privileged to be able to share a country with people like the Palestinians. Then I think so I think the inevitability is not bound by anything. I think what's important is to make sure that the process is one where everybody comes out the other end and still alive and still healthy. I think that's going to be the key issue. I don't think Israel is going to do this willingly. I think it's going to be a very tough struggle. But again, I'll say I don't think it's inevitable that it will be violent. I think these things have proven around the world that you can have these transitions, political transitions, without violence.
Based on your interaction with Palestinians on the ground, are they in favor of a one-state solution? What is the likelihood of both communities, both Palestinians and Israeli, coming together for a common cause, overcoming the differences that they have ethnically or religiously?
Well, the one single democracy is a Palestinian idea. This was the platform of the Palestine Liberation Organization originally. So this was their idea to begin with, and I think it's a good idea. I think Palestinians are willing to accept Israelis as equals, which is generous enough, but certainly not as masters, And the discussions that I have, and it's not based on anything scientific, but the discussions that I have with Palestinians, some people think it's a good idea, some people don't think it's a good idea. But I think people are realizing that it's inevitable. Would Palestinians like to have a state of just Palestinians without Israelis? I'm sure they would. And it's true for Israelis too. But that's not what exists. We're not on the moon. We are sitting in Palestine. There are two nations, Israelis and Palestinians, that share the land. They're divided in about, equally half and half. This is the reality today. The question is, do we want a democracy? Do we believe that democracy is a good thing or not? Those are the two issues. There is no other solution that's sitting out there waiting to happen. We either struggle for a real democracy with equal rights, or we don't, or we allow the situation to continue. These are the two options that we face as activists, that we face as people who are connected to this issue. I would argue that acting for democracy is the right thing to do, which is why I do it.
America, although still the greatest power in the world, but if we see that things are shifting economically, politically as well. We look at the rise of countries like China, we look at the rise of ASEAN, India, and the BRIC countries. How do you think that this will be quite an important factor to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because U.S. has been a staunch supporter of Israel, and it's crucial, that has been a crucial part of why things haven't moved as fast as it should be. So looking at this shift in the power play.
Well, to begin with, I don't think America is so powerful. I mean, I think, America supported South Vietnam and it disappeared. America supported apartheid in South Africa, that disappeared. America supported dictators in South America, they disappeared. So America is not all that powerful other than in its own mind, where they keep saying we are the greatest nation in the world. It's in their own mind. I think you're right. I think if anybody was to be a power, I think China is certainly having a lot of influence in the world and other places, like you said. But there is a shift. I think this non-Zionist point of view that exists in this part of the world, and not so much in the West, is very, very important. And I think again, countries that don't recognize Israel and become major players will probably eventually will have a say and will have an influence because of economic reasons and so on, and because of their influence in that way. And again, I think these things, if we look at history, we see these shifts take place regardless of how powerful the support for a certain cause is. Things change because they have their own dynamics too. Is the change going to come from powers outside that are shifting, or is the shift going to come as a result of a change within Palestine? I think once there's a free and democratic state in Palestine, we're going to see major shifts in other countries around the area as well, positive shifts.
What would you say is needed to speed up this process?
Well, I think more people need to get engaged. I think more people need to be willing to talk about this and be clear about the need for a democracy to replace this non-democratic one state. I think it's important to stop talking about this idea of a two-state solution because it's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the last 65 years have shown that Israel will never compromise on the land. The whole Zionist idea is about not compromising on the land. And so it's important to come to terms with this and then look forward and say, well, what are we going to do? Here's what we're going to do, and be very, very clear about this. Like I said earlier, I applaud countries like Malaysia that never recognized Israel. I think it's a courageous moral stance, and Malaysians seem to be fine with it. The sun shines in the morning, and nobody's it doesn't matter to anybody. And I think this is really an important stance to take, and I think it's important for more people to come to terms with it, that it's okay not to recognize Israel, it's okay to oppose Israel, and it's okay to talk about the day after Israel, which is the day, we're not talking about violence, of course, we're talking about a political transformation or transition that will include everyone in the political process in Palestine.
I'm sure you have had these comments before. Opposing Israel is akin to being anti-Semitic.
Yes. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's a baseless, foundless accusation, because first of all, many Jewish people have always opposed Israel. So are they also anti-Semitic? I mean, that's absurd, number one. Number two, if you support the state of Israel, then you're supporting a state that has, like I said earlier, political prisoners, racist laws, killing of civilians. So that is Semitic, that is pro-Semitic, that is pro-Jewish, agreeing to something like this. It's a baseless kind of an argument which means nothing. So nobody likes to be called anti-Semitic, but at the same time, I think it's important not to get stuck by that and say, well, if this is anti-Semitic, what does it mean when you support this monstrosity? When you support the regime that does these things, does that make you a good guy? So it's important, I think, to continue the conversation.
And how has the conversation been? Conversations on the other side, how are they responding? Is there a broader sense of acceptance, a broader sense of understanding? You
mean the other side being America, or?
Those who do not believe in the rights of Palestinians.
Well, they don't usually invite me to speak.
Are you breaking through that?
I go where I'm invited. I think there is a shift. Yes, definitely. I think there's a shift among, Jewish people are kind of on the fence and really want to know more about it. Like I said, there's a shift in churches in America, which are very important. There's a major shift on campuses, on universities. So there is a shift, and like I said, people are becoming more curious. They want to hear about this Palestinian thing that they haven't heard of before.
Do you think it's partly due to the Arab uprising in 2011 and how things has changed, social media revolution and all
Well, I
things
think the Arab uprising actually took its cues from the Palestinian uprising. I think the Palestinians, for the last several years, their protests have been kind of the model that a lot of the other uprisings have taken, kind of a very clear, determined but non-violent approach. I think that there's no question social media was revolutionary and has contributed a lot to this. There's no question the message is going out much faster as a result of Twitter and Facebook and all this. Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a very positive influence.
How is your book received in Israel?
Well, it's not in Israel. It's not there in the bookshelves. No, it's mostly, it is in the West Bank and in Palestine. I mean, I do give lectures there and so forth. But it's being ignored, which is not surprising because, again, it goes beyond that very limited, very narrow Zionist point of view. And they're not ready for that yet. Well, I plan to write more. I think there are lots of angles that relate to this issue that are not well known. I think there's an ongoing struggle of Palestinians and Muslims in America. America holds Muslims, and Palestinians, particularly Muslims, in prisons for political reasons. I think that's a story that has to be told. You can kind of understand political prisoners who are Palestinians in Israel, but why in the United States? Why have they taken this witch hunt into America? Why has it reached those? Why has it gone so far? So that's I think something that people need to know about. So I'm looking into that and talking to people about this as well. So I plan to write more books and talk about this issue until it's over, and then we can talk about something else.
Okay. Thank you so much,
Sure. Thank you
for coming on the show, and wish you all the best in your endeavors. And thank you so much for watching Vantage Point of this episode. And if you have any queries or feedback, you can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, or you can email me also at cynthia_ng@astro.com.my. That's all for this episode of Vantage Point. I'll see you again soon. Goodbye. Thank you, Miko.